Let's go to someone from Austin, Texas here in the audience, Debbie Sanders.
Getty, you always strike me as being very articulate and eloquent in interviews that I've read and heard. And my question is, I know Neil is the writer, but your family certainly has an important story to tell. And I was wondering if you ever wondered about writing maybe a biography of your family or an autobiography.
Well, thank you, first of all, for saying I'm articulate. Only after 11 in the morning. Well, my mother had quite a life. And, you know, what her and most of my relatives went through in the Holocaust was quite a story. And you can talk to any of them, and the stories they tell you all could be novels. And at one point I started cataloging interviews with her because just for my own family's sake, there are stories that I want to keep alive in our family that my grandchildren and great-grandchildren should know what they went through. So I think that's a story to tell, but whether it's a story to tell to the public or just to keep in my family, I'm not sure about that. But it is something I would like to put together.
How about you, Alex? No, not to laugh. Your family immigrated and ended up in Canada.
Yeah, my parents met in Canada, but they were both from Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia. They also had gone through a terrible time during the war, and they were in refugee camps after the war. My father in Italy and my mother's family in Austria. And they ended up in Canada, where they entered the country and they were sent out to the western part, to British Columbia, to work in the mines in BC or in the farms out west, and met there and came to Toronto, and that's where I grew up. And I think we all have stories to tell in that sense. But my memory is terrible, and I've forgotten most of it. In fact, what was the question again?
The question was, did anybody in your family play music?
Oh, that.
Did you have musical parents or brothers and sisters who were musical, or are you guys the standard bearers for doing music in your family?
Well, I found out after my father had passed away from an aunt, in fact, that my father used to play the balalaika when he was like 12, 13 years old, and I guess he used to play at weddings and stuff like that. But that was hidden. My mother hid that fact from me. She never wanted me to be a musician, so I had to find out from other people.
She's not disappointed now.
No, she's not.
When did you start playing keyboards?
Well, when I was a kid, I took piano lessons like everybody else did, forced to play piano. But I guess it was sometime in the late 70s I started thinking that adding some textures, other ways of adding melody to the band would be fun. I picked up a mini Moog and started adding single line stuff, and that was a very exciting time for synthesizer development. All these companies were coming up with these new instruments, and I just kind of got hooked on the sounds, and I started taking piano lessons again at that point and got a certain level of proficiency, but I was just way too lazy to practice as much as I should on that, and I don't really consider myself to be a very accomplished keyboard player, but I can make some necessary noises when I have to.
Well, it's become certainly part of the whole fabric of what you guys do. And watching you on stage, I'm always amazed that all of you can trigger this entire extra band that kind of plays around you. Does that come from the production and the albums itself, and then figuring out how to do it live?
In the early days, I think, when we went into the studio, we wrote with that in mind. How do we play this stuff live? And we stayed very true to that. We wouldn't put a rhythm guitar in under a solo, for example, because we couldn't do it live. Later on, as we developed our songs more in terms of production, we sort of said, well, we'll figure it out later when we get into rehearsals. We'll try to figure it out some way. And then the technology became a great benefit, and you were able to take things that you'd recorded on a record and trigger it with pedals or whatever, and create a much bigger sound of parts that you played in the studio. And that's really, we sort of were at the very leading edge of that whole technology and how we applied it to the band. And it's, although it's very busy, it's quite comfortable and normal to us up there to keep constantly working on other things.
Yeah, when we first started doing it, the technology really was barely invented. Like, this whole MIDI technology, well, we didn't really have that back then, and we were trying to invent it. And we had these incredible, bizarre-looking synthesizers with these huge cables that would go to our foot pedals to try to trigger certain keyboard notes. And then sequencer technology developed, so you could actually record chords, keyboard chords, on a sequencer and then trigger them. And then, of course, now with sampling being so easy, we can actually lift chords or special effects or even guitar moments and background vocal moments, all kinds of little effecty things, and we can have them programmed to different pedals. So that's what we're doing when we're running around with our feet up there, just supplementing our three-piece sound with all those little bits.
So was there ever a point where first of all, you ever considered having somebody else in the band, keyboards or an extra guitarist, or somebody just knocked on your door insistently wanting to be in your band? I'm curious.
We've spoken about that a number of times. In fact, before the Vapor Trails tour, Geddy said, I could really use a hand with some of the keyboard things. I'd like to be able to move around on stage and have a little more fun. And we just sort of ignored him. And he mentioned it a few times, and we just kept ignoring him. And then the tour began, and it was too late. That's a true story.
But I made them share the responsibility, so they have pedals now. Even Neil triggers stuff on his drum pads.
We have a chemistry in our band, and I think bringing in even a utility musician like that would, first of all, disrupt that chemistry. And secondly, we've always made things challenging for ourselves, and why would we stop now? So, you put the onus on yourself and create a little bit more work, but in the end, it's always more rewarding.
Yeah, we also felt that our fans would rather see us struggle up there to get it right rather than have another member.
So when Neil came into this band, he really brought a whole different texture to what you do because of his because he's a great drummer, but lyrically. So he laid out some just magnificent opuses, 2112, a whole series of things. And I'm curious what the looks exchanged between the two of you were when that kind of came down and you realized that there was a lot more work to do to get off to where this was going.
Well, his entry in the band was a kind of catalytic effect, like we wanted to go in that direction. Alex and I were writing more challenging music than John Rutsey, our original drummer, was comfortable with. He was a basic rock and roller, and we had this opening part to Anthem, for example, from our Fly By Night album. We had that written for ages, and he didn't really want any part of it. And part of our audition process when Neil first came into the studio is we started playing that riff, and it's in a weird time signature, but he got right into it. We looked at each other and went, oh yeah, okay. But when we started touring with him, we really didn't know him. We were pretty well strangers because he was in the band 2 weeks and we were touring America. So we got to know him on the road, and Alex and I would go, this guy reads a lot. And we didn't really want to do lyrics. We said, maybe he can do the lyrics.
If he reads, he can write.
So we said, hey, have you ever written any lyrics? And he said, no. He said, well, maybe you should try. And I think one of the first songs he wrote was Beneath, Between, and Behind, or one of those songs. And we thought, whoa, this guy's now writing too much. I got to sing all this?